Welcome to Between Authors. I'm your host, author Adrian Lopez. What is it that excites us as a reader? It's finding that author or book that you may never have heard of, sort of like the treasure hunt for a reader. The goal for my podcast is to bring to you either those authors or those books that you may never have found, but maybe the treasure you've been hunting for all along. Today in episode 60, I bring to you author Veronica Ramirez. We're going to go over a little bit about who she is, what she's published, what she's working on, and maybe what her plans are for the future. Welcome to the show, Veronica.
Thank you for having me, Adrian. I'm really glad to be here.
Absolutely. I'm happy to have you here today as well. Why don't you begin by giving an introduction to yourself to the viewers?
Okay, so I'm Veronica Ramirez. I have 2 books out, Play the Game and Finding His Past. Play the Game is about Isabella, who finds out that her boyfriend is not who she thinks she is, and she has to run away from him. And that book is about her fighting him and making sure that she can stay away from him the entire time. And Finding His Past about Michael, who finds out that his mother is not who she says she is, and him finding about who he is. I'm also a screenwriter, and I also write poetry as well.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, poetry is something that's always been big for me as well. Do you find, I know it works for me, but do you find maybe that sometimes when you are, I don't want to say stuck, but maybe sometimes when you come up to like a part in the story where you're struggling or you need time to think of something, poetry for me is always a good way to reset, right? You use when you use like a poetry prompt or something, I always felt it's a good reset to get your mind back into the story, and then it starts to kind of flow again. Has that happened for you?
It has happened to me. I really like when I can actually get stuck and then just do a couple poems that I'm working on, and then I can get right back into the flow of the story.
Yeah, it's very interesting how that works, but it does kind of like reset you, and you just kind of can get right back in there. It's much better than sitting there just struggling with it and trying to fight your way through the story. That little reset really does help.
Yeah, it really does.
Um, why don't you let the viewers know your influences, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be authors of books. It could be music, art, movies, anything creatively that influences you.
Well, the person who influenced me to start writing is an author by Pam Munoz Ryan, who wrote Esperanza Rising. But besides authors, I think some of them in the TV industry and the movie industry that inspire me are Adrian Bailon and Jennifer Lopez, who are some also Spanish people who are in the industry who actually fought to be where they are today. And Maya Angelou, who is a great writer of poems. She also inspires me a lot.
Okay, you gave a little bit of a synopsis about your books. Let's start with one of them. You pick which one you want to go with first. And why don't you let us know kind of like maybe where the story came from or how you came up with the story?
Okay, so I'll start with the one that I released in January. That is Finding His Past. And that one is about Michael, who is an 18-year-old freshman in college. And his mom tells him that she's not actually his mom and that she became his mom when she was 4 years old. And he goes on a journey to find out who he truly is and where he came from. I'm honestly not sure where that idea came from. I think I just wondered, like, what would happen if someone just told you something that just exploded your entire world. Yeah. And that's where that book came from. And then I just dived into what Michael's life would be like and who could he trust in that moment in time when the person that he had trusted his entire life, really, he could not trust anymore.
Yeah. And did you do any, we'll go into a couple other questions, but for that storyline, did you find yourself doing any specific research for the storyline as you were building it out?
I did. I researched a couple funeral homes because I have one of my characters who has a house, and then I don't actually remember the name of it right now, but the place where the cremation happens, the character has their house and the place where the cremation has on the same land. So I had to research how that works and how long it takes for a body to be cremated.
Okay. For that story, is there a scene in there that you feel is And I know it's a tough question sometimes, a favorite scene. And what I mean by that is it could be the scene itself, right? What happens in the scene, or it could be how the scene came together. But is there a scene in there that stands out to you?
I don't think it's one specific scene. I think in the book I have the mother who has raised him give him something from his biological mother, and I think that was one of my favorite scenes is him finding out what his biological mother left him, and that he can get to know her through her own words, even though he can't really know her in person.
Okay. On the opposite side of that, was there a hard scene in this book?
I think the ending scene was the hardest, um, especially when he finds out who was the person that betrays him the most. That was hardest because of how long he had known that person.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm trying to talk without giving too many spoilers.
No, and that's what I want. I don't want you to give too much away, so that's perfect. Um, so let's talk about the other book. You said this one you had released in January. When was the other one released?
The other one, Play the Game, was released in 2018.
2018. Okay. You gave a little bit of synopsis, but why don't you touch on it a little bit again as well and kind of give us an idea, or if you know where that story came from?
Okay, Play the Game is about Isabella, who is in a relationship with her boyfriend, and she finds out who her boyfriend truly is and how he's been lying to her. So she runs away. But he finds her, and in his mind, it's like he's not going to let her leave. So he forces her to play a game with her, and whoever wins is basically the survivor of that. So she gets help by an ex FBI agent, Craig, and they work together to try to help her survive. But they're both keeping secrets from each other. So they have to work together and find out and see if they can actually trust each other, or are their secrets going to lead to their demise.
Okay. And that one, was there a certain thing that came about for that story? Was it just something you started thinking about as you wrote it?
I think I had that idea when I was in my senior year of high school, and a friend of mine was in a relationship that wasn't that good of a relationship, and I just kind of dived into what would happen if he was a real criminal and how she could get away from him. And then that turned into fictional characters who have nothing to do with that person, and it just let me dive into the story a lot more and open my mind to being able to write more.
Okay. As the secrets seem to play a part in both of the storylines. Is that something you really go towards in terms of story to be able to build out the story? Because it really lends itself to a lot of directions and a lot of ways to go. Or is that just kind of how these two stories played out?
No, I think I tend to have a lot of secrets with my characters and my stories, especially in all the ones that I am also currently working on, just because it helps, especially because usually the readers know the secret before the other person does.
Yeah.
So they can help so the reader knows the secrets before the person does, so it can actually help them realize why they're keeping the secret and what's making them not tell them the other person the truth.
Okay. Did you do any specific research for that story?
I don't think I did. I'm trying to remember. It was such a long time ago, but I don't think I researched for that story.
Yeah. I mean, technically, part of the research was your friend's relationship and your experience with that being around. So technically, that is part of the research that you did for it.
Yes.
For this story, did you have, same question as the other one, did you have a favorite scene that stands out to you in that story?
My favorite scene was when Isabella finally found herself and she finally did what she had to do to be able to really work by herself and see herself going forward without anybody else.
Okay. And on the opposite end, the hardest scene?
Um, the hardest scene would be when I had to kill off one of my characters in that book. That was the hardest scene to write.
Yeah, I can imagine that. That's usually a tough one a lot of times for a lot of authors, especially as
Yes.
you build the relationship, the character, the experiences, and sometimes it's required for the storyline, but sometimes that is difficult to have to go through.
Yeah, that one was very difficult. I actually struggled with that and struggled whether to do it. But I felt like if that character didn't die, Isabella would never be able to get to where she needed to.
Yeah. What genre would you say these stories fall in right now?
These genres are both mystery suspense stories. They both have
Okay.
an element of mystery in it.
Is that the genres you enjoy reading as well, or are you kind of more broad in terms of what you read?
Yeah, I don't. I read mystery suspense, but that's not my favorite genre. I really read all types of genres. The only genre that I really do not read a lot is horror.
Okay. Um, so one of the questions I like to ask, and we'll touch a little bit more on that a little bit later, is like future works, right? We're gonna touch a little bit more on your current stuff, but do you feel at some point you're gonna start maybe going into some of those other genres or bringing some of those aspects into your mysteries? I mean, because basically every storyline usually is multiple genres. I mean, it has one major genre, but there's aspects of a lot of different ones in there. Do you feel your influences from the other ones that you do read will slowly start working their way into your stories?
I do think so. I think I probably do want to dive into writing a fantasy book and also writing romance and having some elements of supernatural in some of them.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit before we go a little further down that way. Let's talk a little bit more about what you're currently working on, right? And again, I don't want you to give more than you're comfortable with. So, you know, kind of move around and to explain what you're working on, but not give too much away for that.
Okay. Um, so what I'm currently working on?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm currently working on 4 books. One is called Vision of Pain, and that one has a supernatural element to it. That one is about a woman FBI agent named Elena who can speak to the dead and have visions about their why they died and how they died. And she
Okay.
uses that to help solve the cases that she works on. Then I am also working on a poetry book about how I kind of learned to love myself and my mental and anxiety and depression. And then I'm also working on another book about a girl who had been kidnapped and she was raised to be an assassin.
Okay. Those all sound great actually. So, um,
Thank you.
are those things that you're planning to? I mean, they're works in progress, so sometimes it's hard to say. But do you plan on maybe releasing one of those this year, or just going to kind of see how they plan out or how they fall out as you're writing them?
Yes, I am. I'm trying to release Vision of Pain this year because that one's finished. I'm just on the better reader phase of that one.
Okay.
Um, so that one should be out by the end of the year.
Okay. Do you feel like you're going to be on somewhat of a schedule? I mean, it's again, it's hard to plan that, but do you kind of see yourself maybe doing two a year, one a year, or basically it'll depend on how the stories come?
I think it does depend on how the stories come. I kind of want to try to do at least one a year. It just worked out that Finding His Past and Vision of Pain kind of got done around the same time. So I wanted to release them this year.
Okay. And when you're writing multiple stories, and I ask this because all authors are different the way they do it. Do you find yourself hopping around a lot, or do you like to kind of work on the story until maybe you hit a spot where you're like, I need a break, and then you hop into another one, or how do you do that when you're writing multiples?
So when I'm writing multiple stories, I do hop around. I write until I feel like that part is done, or if I hit a writer's block in that specific story, I will go to another story and then begins writing that. And then when I can go back to the other story, it kind of erases my writer's block for that story, and I can continue writing it.
Okay. So you will hop around back and forth depending on how the story's going along.
Yes, I will.
And do you find yourself, are you a plotter or a pantser, or you find yourself kind of a hybrid in the middle?
No, I'm definitely a pantser. I cannot plot my books. I have tried, but I realize that when I plot my books, those books never get written.
Yeah. Yeah, the stories, I always ask this question for that reason, is the stories tend to flow better when you let them organically grow through the storyline, right? And you kind of just, you go along with the story. I've always felt, and again, I don't know if I'm right, but I've always felt that when you plot a story out and you try to stick to that plot, I always feel that that's probably where writer's block really comes from, because you're forcing the story to go a direction it may no longer want to go, right? Because as you've been writing it, now sometimes that story slightly starts to shift off to the right or left, and it's hard to keep it in that restrictive structure. So for me, I can't plot either. So that's why I always like to ask that question, because I just feel organically it's better when you just let the story flow itself.
Honestly, I really do agree, because the story can go so many different ways. And when you have a plot or something to follow, you kind of want to follow that plot and you want to follow what you've already written down. And when you can't, I do believe that's when writer block hits and you kind of struggle to get yourself through that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you probably just write yourself into a corner because the story doesn't even want to be there anymore. So it's difficult, I think. So I think a version of a hybrid version is probably the best way to go, where you let it organically flow, but maybe you have an idea, and it's not a strict outline, but you have an idea kind of where you want to go, and then just let the story flow that way. But it's hard. It's hard to say, because organically, I think the stories always seem to come out better when you just let them flow.
Yeah, I do think so, because I was also stuck on Vision of Pain, and until I realized this story was going to go in a different way than I had already had in my mind, that's when I finally was able to get through it and finish it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just interesting how that works. That's why I always like to ask that question.
It's a
So
great question.
going back, we talked a little bit about some of the other genres you write or read, and talking about you may want to do a fantasy at one point or do a romance at another point in the future. So that kind of ties into the one question which is kind of like a bucket list question, which is basically, at some point in your writing career, are there things that you want to do or make sure you have done at that point in your career, right? So obviously, part of that question is, or part of the answer for you is the fantasy and the romance. Um, for fantasy, I ask this question a lot: is if you do that, and you do decide to go down that road, and you do the entire world building of it, right? To build out that part of it. Do you feel like you may use that world in other instances, right? And think of it similarly to like the Star Wars world, the Marvel universe, where all the stories are different, but they're technically connected in a way where the world's kind of the same. And I always like to ask that of fantasy writers, because there's a lot of work put in to build out the world. So it'd be, for me, I don't know, it'd be difficult for me to build it out for the one storyline and not use it, some aspect of it, in another book or such. How do you feel you may attack that when you do it?
I think if I do attack a fantasy book and build out a world, I would probably do multiple books that involved in that world. I don't think I could just do one and build out an entire world, because I feel like there would be multiple stories within that world that I would want to tell.
Yeah, it's always an interesting question for me, because just the amount of work that it takes for the world building alone, right? All the backstories, all the just everything involved. I'd just be hard for me to see, one storyline. You're like, okay, let me start at another one. It just always I would think you would try to recycle it in some way, even though that world could be completely in the future, in the past, a completely different area. But at least you have the structure and the foundation of it.
Yeah. I do think that just one story wouldn't really tell about the world. So I think I would really have multiple stories and multiple different characters within those stories.
Yeah. Um, for romance, romance, like you said, is something you read and you may want to attempt that at some point. What direction of romance would you go? Is it more like, because there's romantasy, right? There's that
Yes.
direction. There's a darker romance. There's a bunch of different aspects you could take it. Do you have an idea maybe where you would want to go, or again, it depends on when you start and kind of what your mindset is at that time?
Well, I do have an idea, mostly because I am working on a romantic one right now. I'm working on the sequel to Vision of Pain, and that one is diving into romantic. I think I would call it basically like a detective romance
Okay.
because of the fact that they are falling in love while they are working on a case.
Okay. And so that covers kind of like the genres you would want to attempt, right? And
Yes.
fantasy kind of covers the other aspect of the question. But is there maybe like a storyline? Because as most of us authors, we're constantly thinking of different stories we'd like to do. But is there a storyline you have in you? And again, don't give anything away special, but
Okay.
maybe something you've thought about and you're like, I really do want to do this, but maybe it's just not the right time to do it yet. But at some point, I want to attack this story.
Honestly, this goes back to the fantasy. I have the story in my head. I know the characters. I know the names of the characters. I just really haven't had the time to really dive into creating the world and writing the book. But I do have the idea in my mind, and I really do want to work on it and see where those characters lead me.
Okay. Yeah, it would be interesting. It's again, I love fantasy, I love sci-fi, I love all those genres that things that I've read since I was a kid and stuff. But I don't know. I don't know if that's the direction I want to go to have to do all that world building for it because you have to almost write a book, which is the building portion of it, to
Yeah.
write your story, right? So you kind of like writing two books for one. So I don't know. I don't know if that's the direction I would be willing to go as of yet. Maybe in the future.
Maybe. Well, what kind of genres do you want to go in?
I write mostly horror right now, right? I do have like a romance short story, but it's mostly horror. I do like sci-fi, and I may do that at some point, where it does have aspects of that, right? But I think because horror movies are really my main influence, I think almost anything I write may have, some of that aspect in it. I had an idea for a kind of a paranormal romance story where, it's more like a ghost romance kind of thing. And again, I just find myself going more that direction. No matter what genre I think about, I think it's going to have some aspects of something horror related, right? So I don't know. It's hard to say. I love fantasy. I've read a lot of fantasy. My original collection of books that really got me into reading and writing was, you're probably too young for this, but Jessica Amanda Salmonson's Tomoe Gozen saga, which was back in the early 80s, is really what got me into all of this stuff. That really got me into everything, right? The storytelling, the reading, because she took aspects of traditional Japanese folklore. She threw in magic, dragons, wizards. I mean, there's just everything in there you can think of, and it's a three-book saga that she wrote, and that's so. And then again, sci-fi was a big thing I read a lot as a kid, so I have all that background. I don't know if as a writer if I want to take myself down the fantasy route yet. Maybe in the future, but I have a feeling it would probably lean itself more towards horror again if I did do it.
Honestly, I think that would be a great book to read, a fantasy horror book. And if it comes, it'll come.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's the thing. You don't want to force it. Just let the stories come, as they want to. Um, on your writing journey, like you said, the first one's 2018, and you just released the second one this year, correct? January.
Yes.
As you know, do you feel like you've learned something in the process as a writer, as yourself, right, from book one to book two, or do you feel like there's been a growth as a writer in that process, right? Because basically, the more you do something, the longer you do something, you're definitely going to get better at it, no matter what. Even if you're great on the first one, you're just going to get better the more you do it. Do you feel like you felt a sort of growth or sort of change in your writing from book one to book two?
I do think I've sort of grown and sort of changed. Is I stopped not stopped. I started really trusting in myself a lot more and trusting where I wanted the characters to go, and being able to write more and actually trust myself in the process and about when I'm finished and when I need to move on to the next step as well.
Okay.
I also,
Yep.
I also think that between the two books, it has made me learn a lot, especially about the marketing process and making sure that I actually promote my books instead of just putting it out there for everybody. Making sure that I
Yeah.
can
I mean,
actually.
unfortunately, that's probably the toughest thing for all of us is the marketing side because it's really about just getting eyes on your product, right? Every book, right, or every author's voice has an audience, right? There's an audience for, I don't care what the book's about, what your genre is, what your ideas or what your voice is. There's an audience for that out there. The key is, can that audience find you or can you find the audience? That's the challenge, right? And that's what hopefully stuff like this podcast does. Hopefully some of the social websites, TikTok, Instagram, whatever ones are used, hopefully that audience can find you from that you know aspect. But that's the biggest challenge, right? As a writer, you would think the writing's going to come if you enjoy it and you love it, that'll come. You'll be able to do it. It's the other aspect of how do I get my work out there, because unfortunately you just can't do it and put it up and hope it's going to sell. It just doesn't. You got to kind of get it out there somehow.
Yeah, I think the hardest part about actually being an author is the marketing and trying to get your book into bookstores and getting people to actually see your books and read your books and review them as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, unfortunately, it is probably the toughest part of that, and probably the thing a lot of the younger writers don't even know is going to be the biggest struggle, right? It's it's just that it really is the hardest part of the whole process.
Yes, it
But
definitely is.
yeah, it's a struggle. But I want to thank you for coming on, Veronica. I really did appreciate you coming on so we could talk about your books and get them out there.
I really
I want to
appreciate you having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to remind the viewers that I will leave all your links below, websites, book links, any socials you want to share. If you have any questions for Veronica or myself, definitely leave a comment below. And hopefully, when you get the other book ready to go, I can get you back on. We can talk about that one and get that one out there as well.
Yeah, I would really like that.
Yeah, me too. And then again, viewers, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notifications so you don't miss all these amazing, talented authors I have coming up. Thank you for watching, and thank you again, Veronica, for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
That's it. Goodbye.